Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. We all know what it's like to experience fear. Fear doesn't feel good. It hurts. Fear calibrates at 100, which means that it has enough energy to be an important motivational factor in the lives of nearly all human beings. Let's use fear here to denote only irrational fears rather than caution, which is a rational fear. We'd not survive without caution. Being cautious enhances survivability. We justifiably feel cautious when there's a realistic short-term danger. That's quite different from incessantly living fearfully. Being fearful diminishes the quality of life. Fear proliferates limitlessly. Our imaginations are fecund when it comes to considering multitudinous traps, hazards, dangers, and threats. There's an endless variety of fearful futures that we're able to imagine. Being fearful often becomes a way of life because fears are self-reinforcing. I argue in video 81 that ultimately all fears are fears of death. If so, obviously, as long as you continue to identify with your body, as long as you take it to be me rather than it, you'll never experience freedom from fear. Again, the tactic is to allow every fear to arise, rather than to resist its arising, and then continue to ask what happens next sequentially until, and then I die, is the answer. Clinical degrees of being fearful are expressed as anxiety disorders, such as phobias, inhibitions, post-traumatic stress, and excess of compensatory mechanisms, including substance addiction. Death is inevitable. Accepting that, fully realizing it, surrendering to it, can by itself result in greater peacefulness. Fear hurts a lot. It doesn't feel good. It's harmful to experience fear physiologically. As with all negative emotions, fear is often clustered or layered with other negative emotions. They help each other to proliferate. You'll continue to be fearful as long as you identify with the small s self rather than with the large S self. The large S self is life, being, presence, God. Self has no opposite. The opposite of death is birth. Having no opposite, life is not the opposite of death. One tactic that can work for realizing that you are life is to use self-hypnosis as a tool for recalling past lives. It's not difficult to learn self-hypnosis. If an actual past life experience begins rerunning, skepticism will dissolve, which can bring great relief. The key to overcoming fear is detachment from the ego, the egoic mind or self, the small s self. Why? Quote, all fear is a product of the persistence of the ego, end quote. From Transcending the Levels of Consciousness by David R. Hawkins, MD, PhD. Fear dissolves as ego delusion dissolves. The higher the level of consciousness, the lower the level of fear. The ego's prime supports are pride, ignorance, desire, to propagate its continuance, and fear of death. Of these, the most primordial is fear, end quote. From Dr. Hawkins's I. What about fear of an angry or vengeful God? Dr. Hawkins states that while anthropomorphic depictions of God calibrate at 75, the following calibrates at 945. Quote, divine justice is innate and autonomous. It also affords perfect freedom, as well as the opportunity of the evolution of consciousness and spiritual awareness, end quote. One of the major consequences of living fearfully is that fear affects the body by undermining health. I intend to make a subsequent video on health as well as ones on desire and pride. This is called the nocebo effect and can result in such conditions as chronic fatigue syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome, and environmental illness. Want the truth about fear and how to dissolve it? It's simple. All fear is fallacious. Fear is overcome by walking directly into it until one breaks through to the joy that the fear is blocking, end quote. From Dr. Hawkins's The Eye of the Eye. How? Use one of the methods taught in videos number 15 or number 16 to dissolve the fear. To prevent the recurrence of fear, master a spiritual practice, such as the ones offered in videos number 9 or number 11 in the Stress Reduction Wizardry playlist on this channel. But you object, everyone I know is fearful. It's normal to live fearfully. True, but popularity is not a criterion of truth. The normal human experience of life is fearful, but that's just saying that few people are sages. Wholly enlightened sages are never fearful. Humans who calibrate at 599 or below lack realization of their own divine essence. It's not that we are somehow immortal selves. That's an incoherent notion. It's that we are eternal self. In other words, don't confuse the notion of being temporal for whatever duration with the idea of timelessness, eternity, not being subject to time. Quote, few people know what it is to live without fear, end quote. From Dr. Hawkins's Power versus Force. If you want to experience that, elevate your personal calibration to 600 or higher. If you would just like to live with permanently diminished fear, I assure you from personal experience that elevating your personal calibration to 500 or higher will be sufficient. We may not all have the potential to be sages, but we all have the potential to become good lovers. Fear is eliminable. None of us is condemned to live fearfully. Let's end emotional distress.